Welcome back, everyone, to the last day of our workshop week. Thank you for joining. Today, we have quite a long session on enabling systems change, and Tim Hughes will be leading that session. So I won't take up much more time than that. Tim, I'm going to hand it over to you so you can take us through what we're going to do today.
Great. Thank you very much, Mel. Hi, everyone. Hope you've had a good week. So on Monday, we started to talk a bit about systems change, but today we're going to focus some proper time on it and think about kind of why it's relevant to mainstreaming participation, and then what it means for the sorts of actions that that you might want to consider as part of your action plans as you think about how to mainstream participation in your context. So if we can move on to the next slide. Actually, I think it's a couple of slides ahead. Maybe one more again. So today is going to be quite a kind of a practical kind of action learning exercise. So I'm going to do a very quick introduction to what we mean by systems change, kind of why it's relevant to what we're talking about. But then we're going to explore what it means in the context of mainstreaming participation. So we're particularly going to be thinking around kind of how we can create kind of systems change, how we can ensure that the I guess particularly the conditions that are preventing mainstreaming participation at the moment can be addressed at all the different levels. So if we can move on to the next slide. So first of all, I think it's useful to think about, well, first of all, what a system is, and then what systems change is. Anybody on the call want to kind of offer a kind of a definition of what a system is and why we in this particular context? Your hand up or just come in. A few new people joining us as well. Welcome, everyone. So any thoughts on what a system is? So maybe yeah, Kate, go ahead. Kate, we can't hear you. So you're unmuted, but we couldn't hear anything. Oh yeah, great.
In the chat.
Perfect. So has anybody heard the story of the two fish who are swimming in a lake, and one fish says to the other, "How's the water?" And the other fish says, "What's water?" Anybody offer any thoughts as to kind of why that might be relevant to our conversation today? Yeah, Ricardo, come in.
Some very interesting this story, Tim. It's very well related to things that were used to for like common so common that we even realize it exists, and it's very thoughtful to think that some mental models we have works exactly this way. We don't question, and it's almost as we don't see the water as the fish in the story. It's very interesting.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Ricardo. That's a really good description. I mean, so essentially, I guess the way that I often think about systems is it's kind of everything around us. Often things that we don't pay any attention to because we're so used to them being the way they are, but they're the things and the conditions that hold that I guess mean things are the way they are at that moment. So we can kind of relate it to to complex social problems. So we can think about in the context of issues maybe around like child malnutrition or climate change. There's this kind of whole system of kind of web of different conditions, which mean that that problem is a problem, and it's not something that's kind of easily addressed. So we need to kind of start to unpick what those systems might be. So Kate, I'm just reading what you said. So Kate says, I was going to say the system is a set of interconnected parts that often work together to form a unified whole. Yeah, exactly. And that's, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in this context, we're thinking around, yeah, a system being essentially the conditions that mean there's the status quo, there's a problem that we're trying to solve, and the system is the thing that kind of holds those conditions, holds that problem in place. So when we're thinking around systems change, we're thinking more towards then what are the underlying structures, what are the relationships, the mindsets, the different dynamics that hold that kind of problem in place, rather than addressing the kind of the surface level symptoms of the issue. And so when we think about systems, we're often thinking around kind of the whole system. So in some cases, it might be, well, you can apply this to lots of different things. So you could be thinking about the education system, could be thinking about democracy, could be thinking about healthcare, the economy. But within that, it's looking at how the different parts of that system interact, how feedback loops between different parts of the system work as well, and how change in one area of a system might lead on to change elsewhere. So I think probably many of you have heard about the idea of the butterfly effects. You can have maybe a small change over here that has kind of a big change somewhere else. So we're also kind of looking at where some of those relationships might be. But to make this a bit more practical and easy to engage with, if we can move on to the next slide. So there's this model called the Water of Systems Change, which I find really useful for thinking about systems change. And the reason it's called the Water of Systems Change is exactly for the story that I used earlier. So the idea of the fish and in the system, not really, we don't necessarily notice the different conditions around us because they're so we're so used to them that they're just part of life, and we don't really pay too much attention to them. So the idea of this model is that there are maybe some things perhaps more on the surface. In this case, they call it structural change, which is a bit more explicit to us, things that we maybe do pay a bit more attention to when we think about why a problem is the way it is. But then as we go down the levels through the relational change and through to transformative change, those are things that are more implicit, things that we don't often tend to think too much about, but often actually have some of the most transformative impacts if we can start to shift them. And I think one of my reflections is that you can make kind of small changes at the level of kind of policies and practices on this diagram within current mental models, perhaps. But if you want to really have transformative change in the way that I guess we think around kind of, in our case, the role of public participation in democracy and government decision making, then we really need to start to shift the underlying mental models that actually cause a lot of the things that happen above it. So I'm going to quickly kind of go level by level through this so we can understand a bit more about what each of these different kind of 6 conditions entails, and then we're going to do an exercise kind of looking at it in the context of mainstreaming participation. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we'll start off with structural change, and as I said, this is at the more kind of explicit level, things that we do tend to think a bit more about. And so the model breaks it down into 3 different kind of sub areas. So the first being policies. So those might be kind of rules, regulations, different priorities. They may be things, I guess, at the level of, I guess, in our case, democracy, society as a whole, or they could be within a particular organization. So I guess in your context, you might think around, in your organization, perhaps, what are the rules and the regulations that dictate kind of the way that things happen. in your organization, or you might think in terms of the way that government operates. What are the rules and regulations that kind of dictate that? Then the second part of this is practices. So what are the kind of, I guess, the standard practices that that kind of determine how an organization and, I guess, practitioners within that behave? So there are, I guess, as we all know, within our own organizations, there are ways that we do things that some of those might be codified and written down, others might be more kind of underpinned by culture, and but yeah, a whole set of practices that in our case, when we're thinking around mainstream participation, might mean that participation is prevented from happening. And then the third aspect here is resource flows. So how are money, people, knowledge, information directed and allocated and distributed, and what impacts does that have on what is possible, what's not possible, kind of behaviours, all of those sorts of things. So that's the level of structural change. In a moment, I'll give some specific examples around these, but let's move on to relational change. So there are two different areas that the model defines here. So one is around relationships and connections. So this is about kind of who is connected to who within the system, and what is the quality of that connection, and what does that mean for, again, kind of I guess in our case, why participation might not be mainstreamed. And then there's also power dynamics. So who has power within the system? Who has the ability to make decisions? Who has the ability to influence decisions, either in a formal or informal way? And how might that shape the problems that we're trying to address? And then the final level, at the level of transformative change. So here we get onto that level of mental models that Ricardo mentioned as well. And so these refer to, I guess, our deeply held beliefs and assumptions that influence people's actions within a system. So these are often things that we actually kind of take for granted, but actually have a significant impact on all of the other things I've just mentioned, because they often, the way that we think about the world, the way that we think around our organizations or democracy or government, often then defines who has power within that, where the relationships and connections are, where the money and resources flow, what the different practices are, what the policies are. So actually these kind of mental models have a lot to have a lot of influence over everything else. So if we can stop there, actually, so let's just move on. Yeah, we'll move on to, I'll quickly talk about what we're going to do for the practical activity, but then I am going to quickly give a few examples for each of these different levels. So for the activity, we're going to break into 3 groups and go into some breakout groups. And in your group, we're going to discuss one of these levels to start off with. Let me just share my screen so you can see we have a Miro board that we're going to be working on. Just bring this up. Hopefully that should be showing now. Mel, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Okay, great. So you'll see here this kind of replicates that model with the 3 different levels, and then these different kind of components or conditions. So we're going to break into 3 groups, and so your group for the first kind of half an hour or so will be assigned one of these levels, and within that level you're going to be thinking about so for policies, say, what are the conditions, what are the things that mean that participation isn't mainstreamed at the moment that relate to policies, and you'll put those on a red post-it, and what are the sorts of actions or things that could be done to address that situation. So here I've given one example. So you could say for policies, this is something that's come up, I think, a few times during the week, that there's no legislative framework that requires participation during the policy cycle. So that's the problem, that is meaning that that participation isn't mainstreamed. So what could we do about it? Well, we could make participation a requirement for new legislation. So that's kind of one idea. But you can think about this at lots of different levels. So it might be within an organization, what are the policies? What are the, I guess, maybe it's the guidance on how policymakers make policy that you want to think about. And so currently that doesn't include sufficient public participation. So perhaps another one is generating new guidance. So as a group, you're going to work on one of these levels, and then after about half an hour, you'll switch onto the next level, and you'll see what the group before you has come up with, and then add anything that might be missing to it. Then we'll have a short health break, and then we'll come back for the final round. So you'll get to work on the third level, and again, you'll see what the group before has come up with, and have a chance to add to it. So then hopefully we build a bit of a map between us of different things that you might want to think about as you're developing your own action plans, of different issues that might be meaning that participation isn't mainstreamed in your context, and different ways that could be addressed. So just to quickly finish off with a few more examples. So under practices, the one I've come up with is policymakers do not have the right skills for public participation currently. And so one way of addressing that might be to train policymakers in how to do public participation. Under resource flows, I've said there's no budget dedicated towards participation. So something that could be done there is obviously creating a dedicated budget for participatory processes. Under relationships and connections, here I've said that relationships between the public and policymakers can often be contentious. So there might be kind of bad experiences of engaging on both sides. So maybe something that could be done is demonstrating forms of constructive engagement where it works well. Under power dynamics, I've said citizens have limited power to demand the kind of the right to be involved. So yeah, citizens have limited kind of influence in the system. So maybe here another solution could be strengthening legal requirements. And then under mental models, the example I've come up with is public participation is seen as too expensive or time consuming. So maybe something that could be done about that is demonstrating the costs of not involving the public, and I guess where things go wrong or where policies have to be redrawn, and yet kind of demonstrating the risk of not doing it. So hopefully that gives you a few examples to build on. But before we go into groups, does anybody have any questions? Everybody's happy. Great. Okay, so we'll go into the three groups, and yeah, my group's going to start off with structural level. Mel's group will start on the relational, and Kip's group on the transformative.